Okay, I should have the Spencer McBride picture in front of you. You can affirm for me, please?
That's correct.
Spencer McBride is Associate Managing Historian of the Joseph Smith Papers. And I'm sure most, if not all of you, have enjoyed the chance to get in the computer and dig through some of the marvelous repository of materials that's been compiled in those papers. It is such a wealth of information and it's so readily accessible. It is a marvelous gift. And I very much appreciate what that group has done to make those papers available. He earned his PhD in history at Louisiana State, is the author of multiple books, including Pulpit and Nation, Clergyman in the Politics of Revolutionary America, Joseph Smith for President, The Prophet, the Assassins, and the Fight for American Religious Freedom. His writing on the evolving role of religion in American political culture has appeared in the Washington Post and the Deseret News. He's agreed to present Joseph Smith for President tonight to educate us on that significant year in which a U.S. presidential candidate was assassinated. I strongly recommend the book, and I look forward to this session. Many think this is a hoax article, notes that many thought that Joseph was sticking his finger in the political pie to become a political kingmaker. Well, tonight we get a taste of the 1844 political pie. And I suspect that many of us have contemplated sticking our finger in the political pie at some point in life, but there may be a valuable set of lessons for us coming out of this presentation to help us address that particular interest or hunger. Let us pray. God of awesome mystery, who blesses us with quiet nudges through history. We approach your throne of grace, knowing well the misconduct attributed to our race. For we have created wars and havoc in our history that almost never cease, where you have called us to build the cause of Zion, a place, a purpose, a people of peace. Inequity dominates our world, your beautiful world in which we hitch a ride today. And we perpetuate our advantages over others while for a better world we pray. Pollution causes the beautiful Mother Earth to groan where righteous seeds to feed humanity should be sown. We create chasms with our politics and our threats where bridges need repair and new construction needs to span our regrets. This evening, we look at politics as a problem and solution side by side with Spencer W. McBride as our guide. And we ask your spirit to bless us, to increase our mental span, to bridge our current divisions as best as we can, to learn from history those parallels that count toward the building of your kingdom upon Zion's mount. And we ask that you guide us by the gentle nudge, the quiet radiance of your light, that we treat each other as sister, brother, in spite of political differences that blight. Bless us to consider wisely the mystery of our history, the misconduct on the face of our race, and respond to the lessons of the past with commitment to your Zion that will last. In Jesus' holy name, amen. I'm going to intrude upon our normal pattern here because normally at the end of the prayer, I would simply back off and let the speakers speak. But in a previous conversation with Spencer, I heard his presentation for the Mormon History Association or whatever organization, and I've read the book and it's a beautiful book. And I want to recommend it very highly. But he focuses primarily upon Joseph Smith and his run for president. As the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, the role of the Book of Mormon in that politics is not particularly emphasized. And so I'd like to give you just a couple of slides of background on that. And from the Register, Daily Advertiser, and Telegraph, April 2, 1830, you can see the Book of Mormon has been placed in our hands. A viler imposition was never practiced. It is an evidence of fraud, blasphemy, and credulity, shocking to the Christian and moralist. The author and proprietor is one Joseph Smith Jr., a fellow who, by some hocus pocus, acquired such an influence over a farmer of Wayne County that the latter mortgaged his farm for $3,000, which he paid for printing and binding 5,000 copies of this blasphemous work. That's the kind of information that people that were non-Mormons were passing around. Interesting to note that Mormon as a name associated with more money was also spread among the speculators and counterfeiters, and Joseph Smith was thereby also associated with the counterfeiters. I found it interesting that Bushman, in his Rough Stone Rolling, characterized Smith as by the others as being a fraud, conman, knave, and blockhead. Americans knew about insidious scoundrels who undermined social order and ruined lives of their unsuspecting victims. Joseph Smith became the worst type, a religious fraud who preyed upon the yearnings of the human soul. You can understand that there was not a very favorable political content then for Joseph Smith. Alexander Campbell was one of the harshest critics, and he called Smith ignorant and impudent as a knave as ever wrote a book. He thought the idea of forfeiting Jerusalem for a promised land was a monstrous error. He saw that Joseph Smith was placing more Jews in America than anywhere else in the world. He was teaching the message of Christ 500 years before his coming. And he included every error discussed in New York for the previous decade, including infant baptism, ordination, Trinity, repentance, justification, fall of man, atonement, transubstantiation, fasting, penance, church government, the call to ministry, resurrection, eternal punishment, who may baptize, Freemasonry, Republican government, and the rights of man. All these are to be decided by Joseph Smith. So it is certainly a Smith fabrication, as Satan is the father of lies. That's the Alexander Campbell position. I have an article from England indicating that a lady and her husband and 6 children went to Nauvoo, and they came back after being proposed to, that Joseph Smith tried to take their money, but they came back because they found out that they could not see the plates of gold on which the Book of Mormon was pretended. And so therefore they recognized the whole process was a fraud, and so left. Thomas Sharp came into Illinois about the same time the Mormons did, but he landed at Warsaw and became the editor of the Warsaw Signal. And he proposed in an imprint that Joseph Smith should bring his golden plates to Carthage any day within 3 months. We pledge ourselves to furnish a man living not 6 miles from Carthage to translate every word correctly, slow and distinctly, so it can be wrote down while reading the plates, if they're the Reformed Egyptian language. If he refuses, we'll believe he has none of that, or he's afraid of being detected. And if he's willing to bring his plates that are attached to his mummies, he can have them read correctly if they are the Reformed Egyptian. And so here we are with the challenge from Thomas Sharp. Book of Mormon needed to be retranslated. Well, here's his translator, and he says that the translator says the signification of the word Mormon and also the Book of Mormon is that a Mormon is a writer of wicked, absurd, fictitious nonsense for evil purposes to make sorcerers. And the Book of Mormon is a book of gross, fictitious nonsense written by Mormon for Gezelbum's diabolical purposes. Mormons anciently in Egypt were a set of blacklegs, thieves, and robbers and murderers. So how can it be possible that any person can call it divine? It's astonishing. So I'll give you the meaning of Gadianton. You find the word in the Mormon writings. Gadianton was a prudent ruler or governor of a territory or province, one who expels blacklegs, thieves, robbers, and murderers from his province. Gadianton is one who has justice prudently administered to all honest subjects. And finally, the anti-Mormon party was established in 1841 with Thomas Sharp as a prime mover behind it. And that anti-Mormon party as a political force was frustrated because even though Thomas Sharp ate dinner with Joseph on April 6th of 1841, he was not impressed positively by the demonstration of the militia and Smith's power over his people. And then in 42, William Smith, Joseph's younger brother, defeated Thomas Sharp for the seat in the Illinois legislature. And so that animosity continued. But it's interesting to see that the anti-Mormon party produced 5 men who were tried and acquitted of murdering of Joseph Smith: Sharp, Grover, Mark Aldrich, Jacob Davis, and Levi Williams. All of them were members of the anti-Mormon party who accepted the threats and danger of this blasphemous book. All right, let me turn it over to our guest, our speaker. I'll stop the share here so you can see him. And thank you, Spencer, for joining us this evening to give us a review of your remarkable historical action here.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation and for all of you who showed up. We've all learned how to use Zoom in the last 2 years, and while some of us can sometimes feel a little zoomed out, it's moments like this where we get to speak with people we normally wouldn't because of distance. That I'm still really grateful for our kind of cultural competence, where Zoom is a silver lining of a really tough and tragic pandemic. So it's good to be with you from afar. As Paul said, I wrote a book, Joseph Smith for President, from Oxford University Press. And I hate to give you a spoiler at the very beginning, but he doesn't win. I hope that won't dissuade you from reading it, because the way I approached the book was twofold. For people who identify as Mormon, regardless of which branch of Mormonism they identify with, there's often been a lot of curiosity about Joseph Smith and his presidential campaign. Some have no idea that he ran for president. Others know that he ran, but can't really tell you why. They can't tell you whether or not he was serious about his campaign and whether or not he actually had a chance to win. And so my book seeks to answer those questions, but I also wrote it with Oxford for a reason, because I wanted it to be for a general audience, not just for people who already have an interest in the religious teachings of Joseph Smith. Why should someone who may not care about Joseph Smith's religious teachings, may not care about Joseph Smith as a religious figure, care about his presidential campaign, even though it had no chance of succeeding? For the general reader, why does Joseph Smith's quixotic presidential campaign matter? And that's the approach I took, writing for both these audiences. And it's been really interesting to hear the reactions from different groups. And I think I'll find a few ways. Again, the Book of Mormon is not front and central to the story, but Paul invited me nonetheless. But I have a few places where I think it fits in nicely. But I want to start by quoting Charles Dickens. You see, Charles Dickens wrote what I think is one of the greatest opening lines of a book ever. Now, that's just my opinion. And now some of you are probably thinking I have in mind the opening line of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I mean, that's pretty good too. But the one I have in mind comes from A Christmas Carol. And that book is near and dear to me. My family, we read that aloud to each other every Christmas when I was a kid. And always read in time to finish day 4 and 5 on Christmas Eve. Well, the book starts like this: Marley was dead to begin with. And then Charles Dickens spends a full 3 paragraphs explaining just how dead Jacob Marley was, before he circles back to say that Marley's status as deceased must, quote, be distinctly understood if anything wonderful is to come from the story I'm about to relate. You see, we had to know that Jacob Marley was dead, or there would be nothing strange about Jacob Marley and Scrooge speaking in his bedchamber that Christmas Eve, save the lateness of the hour. But because Marley was dead, it makes all the difference. And so whenever I speak to a group of people about history, whatever subject I'm researching and writing at the time, I think to myself, What one fact must be distinctly understood if anything wonderful is to come from what I'm about to relate? And for Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, that one fact is this: prior to the American Civil War, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. I'll say that again. Before the American Civil War and the subsequent passage of the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. The Bill of Rights was originally designed and adopted to protect the rights of the people from infringement by the federal government, but the Supreme Court could not intervene in state affairs to make sure that the Bill of Rights was applied. Now, this kind of messes with some of our cherished myths of American history. For many, in the wake of the American Revolution, religious freedom became a reality. In states like Connecticut, religious freedom didn't come until 1813. In states like Massachusetts, not until 1833. And even after that, if a state, say Missouri, expelled some of its citizens under the threat of state-sanctioned extermination, the federal government had no power to enforce the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment. Now, this used to be well known, and maybe it was just forgotten intentionally, or maybe it's part of our seemingly ever worsening case of historical amnesia that we experience as a society. But it matters. It matters a lot to our story of religious freedom in the United States. It matters to Joseph Smith's story, because that one constitutional practice was why Joseph Smith got into politics. It's common in American history for someone who's a politician to claim, I'm not in it for the power. I'm doing it because the people have called me to this position. And you know what? Maybe there's some genuinely good people that are doing this out of altruistic motives, but even some people who are in it for the power will insist that they're not. And Joseph Smith's one, though, that I really believe was not in it for the power. He wasn't a naturally political person. He entered politics out of desperation for protecting his people and their rights. And so this must be distinctly understood. Let's jump into it a bit. I'm not going to rehearse all the details of the Missouri expulsion. Those are pretty well known. 1838, under threat of state-sanctioned extermination, Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints are expelled from the state and have to rebuild their lives on the banks of the Mississippi River in Illinois. And as they're building a new city that would become Nauvoo, Illinois, it's determined that the Latter-day Saints should send a delegation to the federal government to either get their land back in Missouri, but more practically, to get reparations from the federal government. They draft a memorial that explains all that happened to them in Missouri, estimating their lost property at $2 million. That's in 1839 dollars. And then having those affected by the persecutions in Missouri swear out their affidavits itemizing their lost property. And Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon and Elias Higbee traveled to Washington, D.C., impoverished as they are as refugees, with this memorial and hundreds of itemized affidavits to make their case to Congress. But first, they stop by the White House. And these are the days where you can knock on the door of the White House and they'll actually open. You can't even get within a few hundred yards of the White House door now. And I'm not urging you to try, okay? That's not a challenge. But in those days, with the right introduction, and they had a congressman from Illinois introducing them, you could go to the White House door. And Martin Van Buren would hold almost daily receptions in the parlor outside his second floor office. The Latter-day Saints jockeyed for position. And sometimes this meeting with Van Buren is portrayed as being in the privacy of his office. They're in a parlor trying to get the president's attention. And Joseph Smith has this idealism of American politics. He believes that if he just makes his case and tells Van Buren what happened, that Van Buren's going to support their cause in Congress. They give him a letter of introduction from a prominent politician in Iowa Territory in Illinois. And he reads just one of the letters and he says, "What can I do? I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I will come in contact with the state of Missouri." Or in essence, if I help you, I will lose my very tight reelection bid in the election of 1840. And Missouri is one of the only states Van Buren could count on. And so I don't think Van Buren had any, at least stated, prejudice against the Latter-day Saints. It was electoral politics. It was political calculus that led him. The court had actually ruled in 1833, the Supreme Court had ruled in the case of Barron v. Baltimore, specifically that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. And in 1845, they would rule again, more specifically, that the Freedom of Religion Clause did not apply to the individual states in the case of Promoli v. New Orleans. So this is to say that the Senate Judiciary Committee's whole hearing is about whether or not they can do anything, not whether or not they would do anything, but whether they could do anything. And they have a unanimous decision. All the committee members vote that they have no power in the case. And this shattered Joseph Smith's idealism of American politics. He realized that there were ulterior motives throughout. He thought he would make the case and people would see that there was injustice done and they would correct it, but they didn't. Now, this is going to forever change the trajectory of Joseph Smith's engagement in the political system. But before we do that, while he was waiting for Congress, and I wasn't going to share my screen, but I think, let me do this real quick because I have it pulled up here on my, let's see. Joseph Smith, while he's waiting for Congress, he decides that he is going to do some public relations work. He's going to go out and speak about the church and correct some misconceptions. Paul shared several of the misconceptions that were out there about the Book of Mormon and about the Mormons. And he decides he's going to use this time on the East Coast to help correct some of those misconceptions. And it's interesting, when he's in the White House with Van Buren, at one point Van Buren asks, how are the Mormons different than other religions, other Christians? And Joseph Smith and Elias Higbee downplay the differences. And they say, in our manner of baptism and the giving of the Holy Ghost, all other differences are swallowed up in the gift of the Holy Ghost. Now, I've seen a lot of people bend over backwards trying to explain exactly what Joseph Smith meant by all other differences are swallowed up by the gift of the Holy Ghost. And I would urge them not to, because later in that letter, they kind of explain that they were trying to steer away from questions of religious difference and steer toward commonalities, because it was easy for persecutors of the Latter-day Saints and other religious minority groups to think that they aren't persecuting religious minorities. If you don't believe that these people's religion is real, you're not taking away religious freedom. And so they had to justify their persecution in part by claiming Mormonism as a pretend religion and Joseph Smith as a fraud. And so Joseph Smith's, part of his task in public relations was for Christians, specifically Protestants, to see the commonalities between their faiths. And he does, in a 2-hour speech Bible, whether Mormon or not, would assuredly be saved. Throughout his whole address, he displayed strongly a spirit of charity and forbearance. The Mormon Bible, he said, was communicated to him direct from heaven. If there was such a thing on earth as the author of it, then he, Smith, was the author. But the divine origins of the Book of Mormon, and that the Book of Mormon's principles were congruent with those of the Christian Bible, was important to Joseph countering any future persecution they might experience, but also to get redress and reparations for the persecution they had already experienced. So Joseph Smith returns to Nauvoo, and he has to do something. He can't count on the federal government to help. Illinois has been pretty awesome so far, but he doesn't know if it's going to change. And so he needs the city of Nauvoo to be designed in such a way that he can protect his people and their rights against further persecution. And so the Nauvoo charters, and there's three of them. Often we say the Nauvoo charter singular. There were actually three. I'm not the type that's going to ever correct someone, but when I'm talking, I'm going to use charters plural. One was for the university, one was for the city, and one was for the Nauvoo Legion. Three separate charters, and they're designed to give a high conglomeration of power in the city of Nauvoo. Now, each of the powers in the Nauvoo Charter existed in one of the other incorporated cities in Nauvoo at this time, Galena, Chicago, Springfield, Alton. What made Nauvoo's unique was it combined all of those powers. So they weren't inventing powers, but they were aggregating them in a way that would make some people nervous. But as many of you probably know, in 1840 and 1841, Illinois was looking for ways to please the Mormons, because the Mormons, they were in a unique position. They were a minority in Illinois, but Illinois was so evenly split by the two major parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, that the Latter-day Saints would be determining elections. Whoever they voted for would win. And so both sides are eager to win over their support. And the Illinois State Assembly passes the Nauvoo Incorporation Bill with flying colors. A young Whig lawyer named Abraham Lincoln offers his congratulations to the Mormons, as does Illinois' other rising star, who was then, I believe, Secretary of State, Stephen A. Douglas, long before Douglas and Lincoln had their famed public debates. And so the Latter-day Saints designed the city of Nauvoo almost as a city-state, as a way of protecting their rights, because they could not count on the federal government to do so, nor could they depend on the state. Well, as we know, in time, things that seemed so promising in Illinois start to turn south. And by 1843, it looks like what had happened in Missouri is going to happen again in Illinois. And Joseph Smith's looking for all of his possible solutions to protect his people. And one of them is to engage in federal politics again. And he writes to the 5 men expected to run for president: Martin Van Buren, Richard Mentor Johnson, Lewis Cass, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun, and writes them essentially the same letter, saying, if you are elected president, what will your course of action be toward us as a people? Essentially saying, we will vote for you if you promise to protect us. Now, the Mormons were a minority, but they could deliver Illinois. And in a close election, that might be all you needed to tip the scales. Well, Van Buren and Johnson never write back. Calhoun, Cass, and Clay do. Now, Calhoun and Cass write essentially the same letter. They express sympathy, say, we're sorry for what your people have experienced, but we don't think the federal government should be involved in protecting religious minorities. We believe in states' rights, so there's nothing we would do as president to help you. This irked Joseph Smith. It irked him greatly. In fact, he writes a public response to Calhoun that is effectively a response to Cass as well, in which he says that this idea of states' rights is encouraging further persecution. In another place, Joseph Smith says to the Nauvoo City Council, the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. They are a stink offering in the nose of the Almighty. He's not pleased with Calhoun and Cass. And this is just a personal opinion. I think he was more irritated by the letter he got back from Henry Clay. And no one in American history wanted to be president more badly than Henry Clay wanted to be president. He ran 5 times. And Henry Clay wrote like the most politician response ever. I sympathize with you guys. I don't want to make any promises that I'm going to have to keep if I'm elected. I want to go into the presidency, unfettered to any commitments. That's his response to Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith, when he writes his public letter rebuking Henry Clay, I think he's more upset with Clay. Cass and Calhoun gave an answer Joseph Smith didn't like. It was a principled answer. Joseph Smith disagreed with the principle vehemently, but at least there was a principle there. Clay was just playing politics, plain and simple, trying to get elected. And so by January 1844, it's clear that they cannot expect any of the leading candidates for president to protect their rights. And the church leaders have to determine, what do we do? How do we help? We're desperate. And they determine that they won't vote for any of the candidates of the major parties. And instead, they'll have an independent candidate. And then that candidate should be Joseph Smith. And that they should do everything in their power to elect him. So Joseph Smith puts together a presidential platform in the form of a pamphlet called General Smith's Views on the Power and Policy, the Powers and Policy of the United States Government. The Community of Christ has a great replica that's in the Red Brick Store in Nauvoo, and I think some other historic sites. I usually pick up copies because I like to have them and people inevitably see them and want them, so I always need extras. Some of you maybe even have that exact replica that I'm talking about in your paper somewhere. Paul, is that what you're looking for?
Yes, I've got
That's
it
right.
here.
Yeah, it's a fantastic reproduction. And Joseph Smith was driven to run for president for one issue: religious freedom. He wanted there to be constitutional reform, that the federal government can protect religious minorities when states fail to do so. But he was not a one-issue candidate. He put together a robust and radical, progressive presidential platform. In the very first paragraph, he invokes his disappointment with racial injustice in the United States. He laments that though the Declaration of Independence declares that all men are created equal, that some 2 to 3 million men, women, and children are denied their freedom because, quote, the color of the skin that covers their souls is different than ours. And then he does what many other presidential candidates have long done. They lament the decline of the United States. Now, this is an old trope. And if you've ever tried to push a politician to explain exactly when did the United States begin to decline, they hem and they haw and they maybe give like a general idea. Joseph Smith could tell you the exact date, and he does in his pamphlet. The very day that Martin Van Buren was inaugurated, according to Joseph Smith, was the day that the United States began to decline as a country and as a bastion of freedom. And so he puts together this robust and progressive platform. He calls for the end of slavery by 1850, and that the federal government would do this by purchasing the freedom of enslaved men, women, and children from their enslavers. This was a compromise, ideologically speaking, because for enslavers, they held men and women as slaves because they treated them as property and not as people. Whereas abolitionists would argue that they should not be held as slaves because they are people and people cannot be property. Joseph Smith took a pragmatic approach with a progressive goal in mind, that in purchasing these enslaved men, women, and children, it would in that moment acknowledge them as property so that they would never be treated as property ever again. And so the federal government would take the proceeds of the sales of Western lands and purchase the freedom of enslaved men, women, and children. He called for territorial expansion, and this was the hot button issue in 1844. Should the United States annex Texas? And annexing Texas meant expanding slavery. And then there was a disputed border of the Oregon country with Great Britain. Joseph Smith says we should annex Texas and we should take all of the Oregon country, and that eventually the United States should expand into Canada and Mexico. He calls for the establishment of a national bank, and this had been a debate since the United States was founded, since the adoption of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton and Washington's administration proposes the national bank, and it's a polarizing issue from that time on. Joseph Smith sees it that it's needed, that since the destruction of the second bank of the United States, the economy is in a regular cycle of extreme booms and devastating busts, and that we needed a national bank to stabilize the economy. He calls for criminal justice reform, that we should close the penitentiaries, spend less on prisons and more on schools, that criminal justice, that punishment for crime should be less about punishing and more about reforming the men and women convicted of those crimes, that the penitentiary system was creating a permanent criminal class in a way. He calls for the reduction of the size of Congress. He has been to Congress. He's not impressed by what he saw. And so he wants to see the size of Congress and their pay decreased. But he calls for a stronger federal government, a smaller federal government, but a stronger federal government. He thought that the states' rights doctrines were what feed mobs. And this was the core of his pamphlet, of his platform, that when states failed to protect religious minorities, the federal government needed to be empowered to go and help. Well, Joseph Smith had something that third-party candidates of his day usually did not have. He had a huge advantage. He had a core of experienced missionaries who knew how to travel the country on very little money preaching the gospel. And with the help of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, he dispatches some 400 plus electioneering missionaries to go out and preach politics. Now, some of these missionaries, they were very comfortable preaching politics. Others, not so much. And they felt more comfortable just preaching religion, believing that if they made a convert, that convert would also be a vote for Joseph Smith. So you get some that are, vigorously preaching politics, some that are more, I'm just going to teach you about the Book of Mormon. And if you join the church, then you'll vote for Joseph Smith. It's a win-win. It's interesting, the response, because Joseph Smith sent his pamphlet to the president and his cabinet, the Supreme Court, members of Congress, and major newspapers. Few took him seriously. Many mocked the campaign and mocked his ideas. The missionaries had it reprinted in different cities and passed it out as an electioneering tract. In Tennessee, a mob surrounded Abraham Smoot and other Mormon leaders, not because they were Mormon, but because the pamphlet called for the end of slavery. And in Tennessee in the 1840s, it was against the law to distribute anti-slavery literature. And so the mob chased them out of town because they were anti-slavery, not because they were Mormon. And one of my favorite stories is when Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff and others are leading a nominating convention in Boston, and their convention is interrupted by hecklers. And maybe there's no story that epitomizes Boston. If any of you are from Boston, I'm sorry for my joke here, but I think we've all seen it. The police are called, and then fighting breaks out, not between the hecklers and the Mormons. The hecklers start a brawl with the police, and the convention has to be postponed and finished on the next day. And it's while these electioneering missionaries are canvassing the country that Joseph Smith is assassinated. Now, he is the first presidential candidate assassinated in American history. It's a distinction nobody wants, but there's an asterisk by it, because from all my research, he was not killed to prevent him from becoming president. He was not murdered because he was running for president. Local political concerns were at play, local prejudice against their religious beliefs, their economic power, their political power were at play. So he was killed while running for president, but he wasn't killed because he was running for president. That's the caveat in that distinction that nobody wants. And it's in this setting that most of these church leaders discover that Joseph Smith has been killed, and news takes weeks to get to them. And they make their way as fast as they can back to Nauvoo. But for many, it's been over a month since the murder of Joseph Smith when they get back. And it's interesting because in Springfield, Illinois, for instance, on the 4th of July in the newspaper, they're celebrating American freedom, including religious freedom. Yet in that same issue, there's rumors that Joseph Smith has been killed. And the editors of the Sangamo Journal are saying it can't be true. Yet it was. And in that same paper that the citizens of Springfield, Illinois are celebrating the United States' unique level of freedom is also stories of the Philadelphia Bible riots, wherein nativists who were upset about Catholic immigrants coming from Ireland and elsewhere in Europe mobbed several homes owned by Catholics, burned several Catholic homes and churches. There was a disconnect between the freedom of religion that was celebrated in American rhetoric and what was actually experienced by religious minority groups. Now, here's a question before I kind of get to that wrap up, was Joseph Smith serious? I think Joseph Smith was realistic that he didn't have a good chance of winning. In fact, it was slim to none. Without divine intervention, it wasn't going to happen. But the presidential election, the presidential campaign is just one of several irons they had on the fire at the same time. And the common theme is they're trying to find a way around the states' rights doctrine because Joseph Smith sees it as the principal obstacle to universal religious freedom in the 1840s. So he's running for president. At the same time, the Mormons petition Congress to make Joseph Smith a general in the United States Army, to raise up a 100,000-man volunteer army to defend those who were migrating to the Oregon Country. This is a time when the standing army of the United States was 8,000 men. This, of course, would give Joseph Smith the ability to mobilize U.S. Army troops to protect the Saints if mobs came upon them in in Nauvoo. It was a way around states' rights. Congress rejects that petition. At the same time, the Latter-day Saints, they petition Congress to give the Mormons a liberal tract of land in the Western Territories. It would get them out of the states. They would then be in a federal territory, isolated alone, to practice their religion in peace. But it also put them under federal jurisdiction, squarely under federal jurisdiction. Congress rejects this petition. At the same time, they petition Congress to make Nauvoo a federal city. So essentially to have Nauvoo secede from Illinois to become a federal territory similar to Washington, D.C. And this would get them around states' rights. It meant that federal troops could be sent out to protect the Mormons if mobs came against them. This too failed. But can you see the common element of this? They are throwing whatever legal challenge against the wall they can to see what sticks. And at the same time, they've entered through the Council of 50 secret negotiations with the president of the Republic of Texas, Sam Houston, for the Mormons to occupy the Nueces Strip, that contested border between the Rio Grande River and the Nueces River. Sam Houston needed boots on the ground to bolster his land claim, and the Mormons were a nice option because they came with their own militia, and the Mormons needed a place where they could live in relative isolation and in peace. And so this is where Joseph Smith's presidential campaign fits. It's one of several efforts the Latter-day Saints are making for constitutional reform or to get around a problem in the Constitution that prevented the protection of religious freedom. As much as we celebrate that document for celebrating religious freedom. So in closing, before getting into discussion and questions, I want to hear your thoughts. I'll ask this question: was Joseph Smith right when he declared that the states' rights doctrines were what feed mobs? It's interesting because once the thousands of the Mormons follow Brigham Young into what becomes Utah territory, anyone that knows that history knows that it wasn't easy, that getting away from states' rights didn't solve all the Mormons' problems. That Brigham Young had frequent clashes with Congress and the President of the United States. It didn't solve all their problems. However, if we look at this story in 1854, we see what happens when the federal government doesn't protect religious minorities, claiming its hands are tied. In 1854, the state of Missouri was dealing with another political minority group, an quote unquote unwanted political minority group. It wasn't Mormons this time. The state of Missouri was dealing with abolitionists. Missouri was a slave state. And as anti-slavery advocates and pro-slavery advocates were moving and flooding into Kansas and Nebraska to make those either slave states or free states, many were spilling into Missouri. And Missouri leaders were worried because they wanted to preserve slavery and they didn't want the agitation of these anti-slavery advocates. Well, the sitting U.S. Senator from Missouri was one David Atchison, who was better known to the Mormons as one of the militia commanders who helped expel the Mormons under threat of state-sanctioned extermination. He was one of the more generous commanders, but he participated in that expulsion nonetheless. And now he is a sitting U.S. Senator. And he writes a letter to the U.S. Secretary of War, a man named Jefferson Davis. Yes, that Jefferson Davis, about what they are going to do about this unwanted political minority group. He says, we are organizing to meet their organization. Before it is over, we will be forced to burn, shoot, and hang. We intend to Mormonize them. A sitting United States senator had turned Mormon into a verb for extra legal violence to expel an unwanted minority group, to burn, shoot, and hang those they did not want living in their state anymore. In this case, the states' rights doctrines had fed mobs. Missouri had used mob violence to expel the Mormons in 1838, and they had gotten away with it. So that when they felt they were in a similar situation in 1854, they returned to those same practices so identical to what they did to the Mormons that they even called it Mormonizing. In that sense, Joseph Smith was right. The states' rights doctrines did feed mobs. Now, Joseph Smith was on the vanguard of those calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states. He wasn't a great constitutional scholar. He didn't spend his days immersed in the study of the law. He was simply the leader of a religious minority group who said, there's something wrong in our country when we can be threatened by mobs and the government refuses to help. Others calling on the vanguard for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states, Father Bernard Promoli, a Catholic priest living in New Orleans, whose case would go all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Shakers in New York, who were pacifists. They believed in peace, they believed in abstaining from violence. And when but in the state of New York, there was a militia requirement. All adult men were required to serve in the militia. And if you refused to do so, you were fined $4 a man. But because the Shakers held all their property in common, it was effectively a tax on their religious beliefs. And they brought their case into courts of law unsuccessfully. So all these people calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states were not constitutional scholars. They were leaders of religious minority groups, and Joseph Smith was one of them. Alas, it's the adoption of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War that allows the federal government to enforce the Bill of Rights on individual states. But it's not until the 1920s and 1930s that the Supreme Court consistently applies the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment to the individual states. America has a great history of religious freedom. We have an exceptional level of religious freedom when we look around the world. But if we pretend that it was universal from the revolution on, we are missing some really tragic episodes in our country's history, including the episode of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign as he tried to correct something that he saw was wrong. That's where I'll leave it. And I'm anxious to hear your thoughts, your comments, your criticisms, your jokes, good and bad. Paul, how do you want to do this?
We open the floor for discussion, but as the host, I get the privilege of the first question. We had Bruce Van Orden, who wrote the W.W. Phelps book, and Phelps, he says, that was the ghostwriter for Joseph Smith.
That's right.
And wrote and rewrote